we should talk about your article and your videos on Myanmar, Libya, and Syria, the dangerous parallels there. But I think we need some background here for viewers and listeners just on what happened in February and the background to that. I mean, there's been this long-standing movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, the National League of Democracy, to supposedly bring democracy to Myanmar. She served as leader. She was democratically elected and wound up being sort of discredited by her patrons, the Bonos of the world, the Ken Roths, the Madeleine Albrights, the National Endowment for Democracy, which gave her an award. And they, named her the lady, and she was this global hero. I mean, she came to sort of prominence starting in 1988, which was the beginning of, it was really Gene Sharp's testing ground, was Burma 1988. And she was discredited by her own patrons because she signed off on the military's campaign against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. And now these same patrons are calling for her to come back and restore democracy. Her people are in the street. So I guess before we get into Myanmar, Libya, and Syria, and this kind of arc of instability, the Arab Spring coming to Southeast Asia, what happened in February? What drove the military coup to take Aung San Suu Kyi out of power? And what had been happening leading up to that point?
Aung San Suu Kyi, just like you said, has been a project of the U.S. State Department and also the British government for decades. And they have poured so much into building up her network. And that network, if you talk to any of these people, these so-called pro-democracy opposition figures in Myanmar, these people are beyond, you can't have a conversation with them. They are so brainwashed. And one thing that you will notice is that they are inveterate racists. These were actually the people brutalizing the Rohingya for years and years and years. And the Western media covered it up because just like in Syria and Libya, the opposition are actually people and groups that you cannot present to the public. You need to constantly paper over what they actually stand for, what they believe in, what they say on a day-to-day basis. This idea of Aung San Suu Kyi, the lady, this saint of democracy, and her followers flocking and guiding Myanmar into democracy, this was always a fiction. It never existed. If you talk to these people, and since I've been writing about Myanmar since 2011, and when I used to be on U.S. social media, these people would attack me. They would say things like, the Rohingya, there's no such thing as Rohingya. These are Bengali invaders, and they're stealing our food and our water. It's the worst.
And just for context, the Rohingya are a Muslim ethnic group in Western Myanmar who have been subjected to what the UN calls ethnic cleansing at the hands of the military. But you're saying that Aung San Suu Kyi's crowd, which is now the official supposedly pro-democratic opposition, was directly involved with their hands in that campaign of ethnic hatred against the Rohingya.
Yes, and if you actually read the Western media's own accounts of a lot of these incidents, you'll actually notice that they will admit that the military had to show up and break up the violence, the police and the military. There's also stories where the military-led government, before Aung San Suu Kyi came into power, they tried to grant the Rohingya some sort of intermediate status on their way towards citizenship so that they would be able to vote in elections. It was Aung San Suu Kyi's followers who blocked that. So
why do they hate them so much?
Okay, well, we could go all the way back to before Myanmar, when Myanmar was Burma. It was a British colony, and the British spent over 100 years fomenting this ethnic animosity in between these groups. The colonial army included these ethnic minorities. The Burman ethnic majority was excluded from administrating the colony and from being in the military. So they basically subjugated the majority with the minority, and this has created this vicious animosity that still stands today. These ethnic armed groups, these rebels that we always hear about, that was the remnants of the British colonial army, and the British didn't just leave when they lost the colony. They kept pouring money into those ethnic groups, and then the U.S. poured money and weapons into those ethnic groups, up to and including to today. So this is why they all hate each other, because it's British and colonial divide and conquer, and this is something that they have continuously invested in. So for the Rohingya, for example, the West has tried to infiltrate that group with their fake human rights groups. There's a lot of genuine groups trying to stand up for them, but the U.S. has sent these NED and Open Society funded groups in there to politically leverage the crisis. But they also are backing the viciously racist supporters of Aung San Suu Kyi. So they're fueling both sides. And then when the Rohingya, there was this very tiny armed militant group that sprung up. The guy who was leading that was actually born in Pakistan. He was in Saudi Arabia, and then they sent him over.
Like
and
the Salvation Front or something like that, right?
Something, I think it's the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, something like that. And again, it's exactly what they did in Libya and Syria. They have these extremists. The U.S. doesn't want to sponsor them directly, so they launder the job through the Saudis or Turkey or something like that. And so they were fueling both sides of that conflict. If you look at Rakhine State, where the Rohingya are, and again, I want to point out, these people have been there for generations. I'm sure there's probably people that were brought in by the British. There's probably also people that cross over the border, but there have been Rohingya in that area for generations. They're stirring this trouble up because China was trying to build a port there, and they have a pipeline that goes from that port all the way through Myanmar and toward Kunming, China. This was so that China doesn't have to make that trip through the strait, so that they could cut the time of transit for hydrocarbons. So this was all about disrupting that. And then all along the pipeline, all these armed ethnic groups are being funded and armed to complicate Chinese infrastructure projects and development inside Myanmar. So the Rohingya
thing. I just want to point out really quickly that what you're saying has been even confirmed, ironically, by the International Crisis Group, which is basically a Western intelligence cutout, which is funded by Western governments and is often, it publishes these white papers, these policy papers, and even they have acknowledged that they've linked the insurgent groups to Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, which is the same kind of, those were the countries involved in helping the CIA in Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan. So, I mean, there are a lot of similarities here, of course.
Exactly. So it wasn't about the Rohingya. It's not about these ethnic groups, each and every one of their individual backstories. It's about finding anyone that they can, try to find some sort of ethno-religious fault line, exploit it to balkanize the country, to wreck it, because Myanmar has no real trade with the West. I mean, if you look at their exports and imports, it's single digits. The bulk of their trade is with China and Thailand.
Right, they've been sanctioned
in Singapore, right?
Yes, Singapore. Yes,
that's they've been sanctioned for some 20 years by the West, but it's very hard to hear the military junta, the Tatmadaw side of the story, but I managed to find a clip from 2000, I believe, of one of the generals declaring that they can't allow Aung San Suu Kyi into power because it would turn the country into Bosnia. The country would be completely balkanized. And that's why they have invalidated election results in the past. Is that why the military staged this coup in February of this year? And what has happened since? Because I think what we're seeing in the streets now, with the opposition officially calling for R2P, a humanitarian military intervention, a regime change war by the U.S., is a major escalation that completely validates everything you've been saying.
Well, Max, really quickly, we should give brief context on what R2P is. That's the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was used to invoke Western military intervention in Yugoslavia, which balkanized Yugoslavia, and then used to justify military intervention in Libya in 2011. And as Max said, I mean, I'll get up photos in a second while Brian speaks, but there are hundreds if not thousands, of these protesters that are holding signs saying implement R2P. And on Twitter, there's been these massive social media campaigns, implement the responsibility to protect, which is the clearest possible sign you can, the clearest call you can possibly make for Western foreign intervention in your country.
Exactly. So
on the
the
February coup.
Yeah, so the reason they did that was because even though Aung San Suu Kyi was being attacked by the West, seemingly, I don't think that was the West trying to oust her from power. I think that was just them putting pressure on her to cut ties with China, even though there's no alternative. There's no alternative for Myanmar to turn to if they did that. And so I think they were putting that pressure on them. One, because I think they still wanted a pretext to get involved. I always suspected that whole Rohingya crisis they were fueling from both sides. They wanted to turn that into a humanitarian crisis where they might. It's their dream to put Western troops somewhere else on China's border other than Afghanistan. This is their dream, and Myanmar is the only vulnerable country in the region that I think they think they can do that in. So I always figured that was the reason they were fueling that Rohingya crisis, but also they might have wanted to put pressure on Aung San Suu Kyi to obediently cut ties, just like Australia is doing, cut the throat of their economy just to spite China and to please Washington. So I think that was the reasoning behind it. Myanmar's military was under no illusions that somehow Aung San Suu Kyi was going to turn around and work with them and build a future together. Her entire network for decades has been built up and is entirely dependent on the West. All of that money coming in. If you go to the NED's website right now for Myanmar, which they're still calling Burma, the British colonial nomenclature, you will see, I think, is about 80 programs, and that's programs, not the individual organizations or people. That's just the programs. It's a lot. It's a lot more than here in Thailand. And the NED funding here in Thailand is very disruptive. So we can only imagine just how deeply they've penetrated Myanmar's society. Every aspect of socio-political day-to-day life has been infected by these NED-funded organizations. If you look in their media, because the government's media, international media, doesn't exist, they've got the Irrawaddy, Myanmar, Myanmar Now. These are newspapers you will see the Western media constantly citing. They're all funded by the NED. And they have this Assistance Association for Political Prisoners. I think we remember the fake human rights fronts in Libya and Syria, tallying up the deaths day to day. This is what they're doing, AAPP. This is what they're doing in Myanmar. And you will see the Western media cite them almost on a daily basis. The guy who founded it.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian. I just want to point out, keep going.
Okay, we'll just get this one out. The guy who founded it and runs it, Ko Bo Chi, he has his own web page on the NED's website because he's an NED fellow. And of course, AAPP is funded by the NED. So that's who's giving you these death tallies on a day-to-day basis, a U.S. government funded front.